Okay, why don't we see what we can do here. We've got a little bumper for the latecomers. Just a couple of cleanup pieces. Charles and Chuck and Sandy were nice enough. They're cleaning out their repertoire. There are numerous, on the table over here, numerous magazines. BBC History. And it just so happens the first two I pulled out, the first one says, How Elizabeth Woodville Defied Richard III, which is next week. And the next one I pulled up is The Last Battle, the Bloody Clash that ended the War of the Roses. And that's 2 weeks from now, so I think I'll take the rest of the time off and you can read from the Yeah, just randomly off the top of the pile. Also, in passing, please be careful. If you like Shakespeare, or if you can abide Shakespeare, a couple of years ago, Benedict Cumberbatch, Hugh Bonneville, Judi Dench, and a couple of others got together and released some Shakespeare. And it is called The Hollow Crown. It deals with Henry VI. It deals with Richard III. Now, we're not that far yet in our presentation, but this is the end, if you will. Henry VI, we got into it last week because Henry VI had some mental problems, was overthrown, etc., etc. But it is very... How do you tell people that don't like Shakespeare that it's good for them? It's kind of like medicine. This does a very good job. It is 6 hours and 19 minutes in 1, 2, 3 plays. So each play would be about 2:06 or thereabouts. So figure each play to be 2 hours. Not much different than, say, if you went to the Guthrie. But they are screen adaptions, so there's a little bit of stage movement. It's not like the Globe where they had to stand still or fall off the edge of the stage. But Benedict Cumberbatch, Hugh Bonneville, Judi Dench, Michael Gambon, Sally Hawkins, Sophie Okonedo, and Tom Sturbridge. It's a top flight cast. Where did I get this DVD? Would you believe I got it from Amazon for $5? Used. Yeah. But it was $5. Well, there's 6 hours of entertainment, So, this is called The Hollow Crown. Now, Crown. There are 2 editions of this. There is an older one and this one. I would suggest if you're not into black and white movies and the Lon Chaneys and those boys, I would suggest you look for the names Cumberbatch, Bonneville, Dench, and make sure you get the right one, because there's 2 of them. It's been done twice. This is the second version. But it was well worth, for me, the money I spent. I don't know. Has anybody? Crow. But again, You've got to know Shakespeare to appreciate those, because the humor in there is so fast. Anyway, okay. Now, moving on. We had a couple questions at the end of class last time that I took under advisement and took home. And so we'll start, if I may, there today. The answers are in your handout. And the first one, I realize now I typed it up wrong. It reads incorrectly. It reads Richard III, Duke of York. That is not correct. There's a comma missing in there. It is Richard III, Duke of York. That is not King Richard III. Okay? That's Richard, comma, 3rd Duke of York, also called Richard Plantagenet. Today's handouts. And I would say it's, let's see, there's page 1, 2, it'd be about page 3. It says Richard III, Duke of York, and it should be Richard III, Duke of York, the 3rd Duke of York, not Richard III. If you read that wrong, you come up with King Richard, and King Richard doesn't come on the scene until 1508, 100 years later. And I thought I was doing such a good job. Oh, well. If you remember in our video last time, Richard played rather a major chunk. And the question came up, well, why is he even there? Where did he come from? How was he tied to? And I said I was quite sure that he was tied through our boy Edward III, who had 6 sons. And sure enough, if you read this piece of paper from top to bottom, you read his genealogy, Richard, 3rd Duke of York. But if you read it the other way, if you read it from the bottom to the top, you see at the bottom, Edward III, King of England. And there he is. And then his son, Edmund of Langley, and his son, Edward, 2nd Duke of York, and then his son, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and his son, Richard III, the Duke of York. Okay, so this is where Richard, shall we say, got his training. And so, yes, he is royal. He does have the right to be standing around there criticizing. So why, how, all that stuff. When you, in these days, when you usurp a kingdom, it is might. There's a little bit of political skullduggery always, but usually this is might. My army is bigger than your army. We can kill more than you can kill, or we did yesterday. That's the thing that controls. So when you're dealing with this, remember that everybody has their own men at arms, which is usually called men at arms. And you go, huh? What's a man at arms? That's kind of like a great beast living. No, that's something else. But the men at arms, and they are hired and paid for by their liege. Okay? Liege lord, L-E-I-G-E. And when their liege lord pays them, they do what the liege lord says. And so these soldiers don't think in terms of the politics. They're not worried about who should be king. They're worried about who paid them. And then you go to the next scene and you experience the battle. And after the battle, it's winner take all. And the winners literally would go through the battlefield and strip the armor off of the dead and dying. And if they weren't dead, they were after they went through and stripped off the armor and any valuable they could find. And so the only ones who survived battles at this time were the leaders who were worth something, who could be ransomed back. So if your side lost and you were a leader, you could expect your family to have to pay to get you home. Plus, it probably would bankrupt everything that you've got to get you home, because then you're out of favor, so you've got no income. Richard ended up on the good side, because Richard III, Duke of York, said, we're going to go up, and he did. He went up against a man who had some real mental problems. And it wasn't too difficult then for him to go to a meeting and rub shoulders and say, hey, you know, that last move that he made, that wasn't too sharp. We need a good leader. And it's that kind of skullduggery that leads to an overthrow. And in this case, it led to the overthrow of the king. Okay. Now, the other name that came up was Margaret of Anjou. And Margaret of Anjou is another one of these who knew where her bread was buttered, if you will. The wife, as we have said many times, and I love the term, so I use it, the wife in every case here is nothing more than trade bait. They are used to seal deals. They are not of any value in of themselves as a human being. Now, once you accept that as a way of life, then it's a matter of, okay, I'm playing chess, and I'm going to move this person over here, and I'm going to move that person over there, and the pawn, which is made out of plastic, is no more valuable than well, no, not quite. Because the queen still has the ties back to her family. And the queen can and does control. What usually ended up happening, and is what happens here, is that we go laterally, and it's the king's uncle or someone like that the queen can't really control. She can control her own children for certain, and she might even be able to control the church. But to control her uncle, that's a bit different. Unless her uncle, well, let's look. I was asked, Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, where did she come from? What was her line? Well, it took me a bit, but here she is. Daughter of Rene, daughter of Louis II of Anjou. Now, remember, please, stop. France is not France the way we know it. France is made up of 6 lesser colonies. And France is everything to the right of Paris as you look at the map. And the other 5 colonies are all scattered along the western edge of France, crammed between Paris and the English Channel. And Anjou is one of those minor, I would call them principalities, but no, they claim to have their own king. Louis II is the son of Louis I, who is the son of John II. But notice, when we get to the middle of the page, John II of France. We've crossed over to the other side. We are not amongst those 6. We've crossed over to France. And this means that you have a tie to the country of France. Doesn't matter what the country looks like. Politically, you've got a tie to the country of France. John II was the son of Philip of France, son of Charles of Valois, Philip III of France and Isabella of Aragon, and Louis IX of France, who led the Eighth Crusade. Now, just because he led the Eighth Crusade, he's smiled upon, just like Richard I, Richard the Lion-Hearted, good King Richard. He was a mean son of a gun. And Louis lost not only the Seventh Crusade, but the Eighth too. He got both of them wrapped around his ears. But because he led them, and because he was from France, and because he was the brother, oh yeah, you got it. He went down in history with a big plus by his name. And that plus carried through all the way to Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI. She was powerful because she had ties in the home country. Yes, she was from Anjou, so Daddy is back there. But she also had ties to France. So whether anybody likes to say it or not, and whether anybody will admit to it, she had France backing her side of the British government. Okay. Now, I don't know. I thought, Linda, was that your question that we had? Where did she come from? I think it was.
I'm not sure. I know I was asking about Richard.
Yeah. Well, you got more than you bargained for. All right. So now you've got those two. Today I want to add in a third. The oldest generation, the youngest is at the top, the oldest is at the bottom. The other person I want to look at today is another, I almost want to say ne'er-do-well, but it's just the opposite. He did very well. It's just that the man had no morals. His name is Richard Neville. Richard Neville. And history has tagged him. Oh yeah, we got to give him credit. He is the Earl of Warwick. Yes, Warwick. Not Warwick. Okay? That second W doesn't exist. That second W is not pronounced. And the A is pronounced like an O, and it comes out Warwick. How do I know? That's my mommy's name. All right. So, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. He is also the Earl of Salisbury. And let me read this little short paragraph. The Nevilles were an ancient noble family from Durham in the north of England. Richard Neville married Anne Beauchamp and through her secured the earldom of Salisbury and substantial fortune. Luckier still, Anne's brother Henry died, and so did his daughter, meaning Richard found himself the Earl of Warwick and Salisbury. Okay? Now, Salisbury is down on the south coast. Warwick is up in the middle, more centrally located. Salisbury is down south. Salisbury is down by the coast. Let's see, where should we claim something near Salisbury? How about Southampton? How about some major seaport that's got import coming in so that we've got a decent source of revenue for this wealthy family who needs it like they need a hole in the head? What happens here is that Warwick has some money. And with money comes that disease that we call greed, which means I want more money. But Warwick was also smart enough, and that's the other thing. I'll stop right there. He's referred to both ways. He's referred to as Neville, and he's referred to as Warwick. He is Richard, the Earl of Warwick, Richard, the Earl of Salisbury, but they call him Warwick. You think it's not confusing to try and keep track of these boys? They got 3 names and they're all legit. But the thing is here that he has money. Therefore, what does he do with the money? Well, he takes care of it by hiring a large military force, an army. How do I mean that? Well, just exactly what I mean, because a long time before this, man, there was something called the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta set up a form of government that really isn't known much anymore, and just as well leave it there. But, excuse me. It meant that the king couldn't have an army. And because the king couldn't have an army, he had to draft, if you will, from everybody else. And he'd go to Nancy, he'd say, I need some soldiers from you, and I need some from Fran, and I need some from Arlene, and I need some from Linda, and I need some from everybody here to contribute because we're going to go to France and we're going to fight a war. And what you're going to give me in men, in horses, is what your tax, what your rent for this year is. So you give me that. We go to war. We go to that battlefield, and hopefully we win. Because if you win, your men get everything that's dead and dying on the ground. And if we win, I get the land, and then I can dole it out back to you. So now you're the excuse me. You're the Earl of this whole land back home, but now you're Earl of land in, well, let's call it France. Also, if we lose, we could have some major problems. So you're going to make sure your men are outfitted. You're going to make sure your men are trained. You're going to make sure your men know what they're doing. You're going to make sure you don't lose. That's your incentive. And of course, that keeps you in the good graces of the king, and when the king is handing out accolades, then you're there at the receiving line. If you happen to get killed in the line of battle, well, your son is there to step forward and take over for you. Neville is a man with an idea. And his idea is, well, if I can't be king, I will pull the strings on the king. He is going to turn into my puppet. Now, if you think in terms of some of the kings that you've heard about, it might be rather easy to pull the puppets. I mean, we know that there's one here somewhere along the line who's mentally deficient. And if I can somehow figure out I can be his best friend advisor, he'll do what I want. Well, that means I'm almost as good as the king. And if I could pull some more strings, they'd set up a regency. And as a regency, I would be appointed by Parliament to the king's advisory committee and maybe as chief advisor. And of course, I'd get paid for that. And I'd whisper in the king's ear maybe 3 times a day something that I want the king to do. And I wouldn't necessarily tell him what is going to happen if he does his step. I'm not going to explain to him that 3 steps down the line, I become a much more rich person. I'll just give him the first step and then the next 2 will take place. Or maybe if I get him to do the first step, I can do the second and third. So it is important to me. Richard Neville is the only man who has ever married off 2 daughters to opposite sides of the same war. 1 daughter to this side and 1 daughter to that side, depending upon which side of the Wars of the Roses, whichever side was in power, that's where he married his daughter. Remember, I told you that daughters, women, were nothing more than trade bait. But if your daughter is married to the king, I guess that makes her the queen. But if your daughter is the queen, can you get a whole lot closer to the king? I mean, the prince is now your grandson. Well, very dangerous. Very dangerous, but at the same time, very rich. Okay? Yeah. Well, now this works until one of the kids in the royal family dares to do something that Richard Neville doesn't like. In other words, he doesn't marry Neville's daughter, and he has to marry her to a different son. Good thing the king had more than 1 son. But in doing so, there is a story here, and it is a very famous story. I don't think I'm telling anything out of line. But Edward let me get the right number for you. Edward looks like about 4. Is a man of his own mind. And he says, no, you know, I like this other woman and she likes me. And this is such an odd situation that the king goes out and marries a woman in a small chapel by a small priest and doesn't tell anybody and doesn't kill the fatted hog and doesn't have a big party. And it's 2 months later or a month and a half later that Richard Neville finds out about it, and he is beside himself. He figured he would pull the strings of the king by having his daughter married to the king. It didn't work. He was mad. He was so mad that when there was a conflict, Richard Neville actually switched his allegiance away from that boy who did not marry his daughter and shifted his army and his money and his talents and his resources to the other side. And yes, it was big enough. It was big enough that it tipped the scale. And his would-be son-in-law is not on the throne. Yeah. The two daughters' names, all right. The youngest is Anne, who ends up marrying Edward of Lancaster. And the older is Isabel, who marries George, the Duke of Clarence. Now, both of these then are brothers to the king. He doesn't, you get the idea. All right. Now, from this, oh, the other thing I wanted to mention to you, please. There is a woman who has made a couple bucks with this period of time. Her name is Philippa Gregory. Okay. And one of the books is called The Kingmaker's Daughter. So if this man's life intrigues you, as if you haven't had enough of it already, this is not just a wedding, it is a celebration of my Father's power. Nobody seeing the court assembled here at my Father's invitation, bowing as low to him as if he were the king, when he walks through the beautiful galleries of Calais Castle, set in the fortress town that he held for England for years, can doubt for a moment that there is a power equal to the King of England, perhaps even greater than the King of England. If Edward chooses to ignore my father's advice, he can consider that there are many who think that my father is the better man. Certainly he is richer man with a bigger army, and now here is the king's brother, forbidden to marry, but freely taking my sister's hand in his own, smiling with her with his blood-easy charm, and pledging himself. Now that is from Woodville's point of view. As written by Philippa Gregory. All right. All too important is that Neville takes everything very personally. He has an attitude which even today I think we could say prevails in the British monarchy. It's not what the individual wants, it's what's good for the country. And Neville really didn't care what the king wanted. He never cared what a woman wanted, including his own wife. But he never cared. He saw himself as Father England, and what he wanted, he knew was best for the country. And so what Neville wanted, Neville proceeded to get. And for quite a period of time, Neville runs the country. And when I say runs, I mean just exactly runs. Now, he doesn't live forever. Nobody does. But when you jump back and forth from one side to the other, and then think, well, maybe I should jump back, you're not warmly received, nor are you trusted. And in that you are not trusted, neither are your, what's the word I'm looking for? Associates? Your soldiers? And this period of time is nothing more than constant bickering over here and bickering over there and a little bit of backstabbing over here. And that's all right. I mean, we get two Lancaster and Kings in a row. And then we get Yorkshire and a Lancaster, and then we get 2 Yorks in a row, 3 Yorks in a row. So it's not like we've got long, protracted battles. It's more like we got a bubble up over here, and then after a few years, another bubble up, and that's the term wars. Wars of the Roses. Or should we say the wars between the 2 roses? Now, don't know where the roses came from, because neither Lancaster nor York had a rose in their symbol. Some people go as far as to say Shakespeare created it. And whether it's true or not, it is a fact that you take the red rose and the white rose and you combine them and they become the Tudor rose, which is red and white combined, which is what you would expect when you combine these two. Neville has, as I am telling the story, another problem, and that is his father is Richard and his son is Richard. So we talk about Richard Neville. We don't know for sure whether we're talking about grandpa or father or son. But most of the time, we're talking about the father, the one in the middle, junior, if you will. When you have, under the feudal system, the mandate that you're going to go over here and get a few soldiers, and over there and get a few soldiers, and over there and get a few, you have no cohesion. How do I make Nancy's soldiers fight with Bob's? They don't know each other. They may even speak a different dialect. If I have a lot of land, you could come from almost up to Scotland, and he might come from almost down to Southampton, and I'm going to put the 2 of you together, and you're going to work together. It doesn't work that way. Unless you are big enough and you have set up the system where Nancy is big enough that she has a large enough army that you can operate on your own, within your own language. And Bob is the same way. But you're both going to report to me rather than being independent. The independent isn't quite true, but under the king's system, I had a lot of little independent armies. Under Neville's system, I've got 3 major blocks of artillery, of soldiers. All right? And because of that, when Neville put his soldiers into battle, there was more cohesion. That's why Neville's forces won. That's why Neville became so powerful. There is much speculation today that Neville was running a bankroll that if he had ever lost, he would have been bankrupt. Because what he probably had to do was make promises that if we defeat this land, I'll give you that. And so these soldiers, many of them, were working on what you and I would call speculation, which was their incentive to win. Yes? Did Neville move around? No, he didn't have to. Because he set it up, he set up his mini kingdom the same way, but again, he's got one person in charge over here and Somerset, one person in charge over here. And he had 2 lieutenants, and the 2 lieutenants kept everything in line. Yep. Right. We have, you want to... We can talk about Neville for hours and hours. I don't want to get too far away from the kings. I don't think that's healthy. It will get us mired in the grapevines, and we will not recover. So with that, what I'd like to do is kind of abandon poor Richard Neville and leave him with, let's just say he made a mistake. And in one of those battles down the road, he is going to throw his weight behind the wrong side. And he dies in battle. He was either the most respected man or the most despised man, depending upon where you were. If you were one of his people, very respected, very good man. But because of the fact that he changed sides, he wasn't really trusted by either of the, shall we call them, kings. And so when he gave his endorsement, when he took his endorsement and said, you should not have married that woman, you should have married my daughter, and went away, in a sense, he lost the respect of both sides. That started his downfall. And at the end, when he defends a king, the king put him in the worst possible position, feeling probably that Neville wasn't dependable, but moreover, he wasn't respected. And he sort of fed him in to the calculations of, yes, there'll be some losses. It doesn't mean that he didn't pull a lot of strings. I've been in Warwick Castle 3 times, and it is just a monstrous chunk of land. It's beautiful, right on the edge of the Avon River, about 7 miles from Stratford, where Shakespeare lived. And the thing that impresses me, and this has got nothing to do with anything, but whoever was the advisor there, I think it is still owned by the Neville family somewhere, but they have given the management to a small company, Tussauds, and they have gone in there and they took the lower level of the castle and they put in their wax figures, which they are very famous for. And they set that level up as it was during the War of the Roses. And they've got the armor and they've got the horses' wax and they've got them in armor, and you walk through and you are walking through history. And you go upstairs in the same castle, and there is Churchill, and there is the king, and there is another Neville, as it was on Stille Nacht in 39. And so you walk out of that area, and yes, there's always the dungeons. Yeah, you got to take the kids to the dungeon. But outside, we were outside, out back, if you will, just to the side of the ice cream stand. They were flying the Falcons, and across a river. You're on one side of the river. The people displaying the Falcons, who are flying the Falcons, are on the other side. Microphones are going, and the perch for the Falcon is right behind your head, but you don't know it because you're sitting there. And this Falcon is coming right. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, Warwick is still Warwick. Warwick will always be Warwick. Now, quickly. We've got Richard, Henry, Edward, and some few others. Henry IV and Henry V. These are the shining stars in the Lancastrian family. Henry V is probably one of the highest rated military kings in all of English history. And that is because he had the right general in the right place at the right time with the right longbows. Have you ever wondered where they got their arrows? After each charge of the enemy, the archers had to go out and retrieve their arrows and use them over again. And yet at Agincourt, Henry V beat the French troops badly by lobbing volumes of arrows into the air, and they came down as a hailstone, piercing the leather armor, but more importantly, defeating the horses. Now you say, well, it's not nice. Somebody shot a horse. That's not. In war, I'm afraid we have to say anything goes. But if you take a knight who's in 200 pounds of armor and you take him off his horse, he is a turtle on his back. He cannot move.
But the arrow shot up loses 90% of its effectiveness coming down.
Right. But all it has to do is disarm the horse. All it's got to do is make the horse lame. Not kill it, but lame, so that the person cannot ride the horse. Then you lower the bow, the longbow. And remember, longbow has got some force behind it. And you start piercing the armor. And if you're lucky, you go between the plates and the necks and the arms. Agincourt meant that the English were taking land back that they had lost previously. Sorry to say they're going to lose it again, but what has going on here is that since William the Conqueror, we and everybody else have been looking at England. France has been looking at Normandy. And France has been incurring little bits here, and a little kingdom here, and a part of a kingdom there, and a little incursion here, and another one over there. And it is at Agincourt that the English make one of the first reversals where they actually take land back. And that is what makes Henry ranked as one of the best kings, because he took land back from the French. Because Richard II and before had all been in a slow process of giving land to the French. And Henry V reversed that. So Henry V, he's a good guy, but he dies of a wound from battle. Now, don't feel too sorry for Henry V, because Henry V is one of these English kings who lives in France in battle. He doesn't come and doesn't stay in England very much. He's the king of England, but he's a 10%er. 90% of his time he's in France. He dies of a wound, and his 9-month-old son, Henry VI, became king. Obviously, he came home to England part-time. He died at 41 years. No, you get my hand in the right place. 1413 until 1422. So what do we got there? 9 years? 9 years that he was king? He made quite an impact. He impressed people. He got stuff done. People expected that of his son. Come on, his son is 9 months old. But it's during this period of time that everybody's fighting to be king. It's this period of time. Yeah. You see somebody like Neville stepping into this breach? Somebody who's got to drive to get somewhere, this is a perfect opportunity for them. And then, as we saw last week in the video, we have a king who has some mental problems. And all of a sudden, everybody is saying, down with the king. There are a few people who are loyal to the king. Maybe there's where Neville would line up. Or maybe Neville would line up on the other side to overthrow the king and then look at all the glories. Because everybody who lost in battle loses their land. And look at all the land you could gain by being on the side of the new king. 9-month-old when he became king. He was king from 22 to 61. Yeah. And then again when he was 71, yeah. But his father is the one you want to be careful of, because it is his father's mental weakness that triggers in the mind of our videotape. That's where the War of the Roses started. Well, I didn't quite agree with that, so I went back farther to lay some groundwork. But the video started last week then with basically the overthrow or the disagreement that Henry VI should be king. Now, some have said this is sleeping sickness. Some have said it's all kinds of stuff. It's inbreeding is what it is. Okay? There are so many things that can go wrong mentally with inbreeding. They know this because they've dug into the Egyptian tombs, and they found that those people also had problems mentally because of the inbreeding. They don't know exactly what, they don't know exactly how, but here's a man who was unconscious for 18 months. Open his lips and dump some soup in, I guess. You know, this is nothing. It's going to come back. This is not the only one who's got this problem, okay? But I'm just saying that this occurs. And when you look at that sheet I gave you of who was their mother and who was their father, and this one on the back in today's handouts, you know, you've got Rene of Anjou and Lorraine and Anjou and Aragon and Anjou and Anjou and Luxembourg and France and Anjou and Anjou. Anjou ain't that big, and we keep pulling people out, and we keep recycling that family. Now, Henry and Edward went at it enough times that Henry VI and Edward IV were on, we could say they were on a first-name basis. I think what we best do is look at today's installment, and then we may have time at the end for questions. Now, let's see.
Nearly 600 years ago, England was torn apart by a series of bloody battles for the throne. In just 30 years, the crown changed hands 7 times. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. It was one of the most turbulent and violent periods in British history. It's known as the Wars of the Roses. In 1461, 6 years after the Wars of the Roses erupted, the imbecilic Henry VI, pretty much the weakest king England had ever known, had his throne snatched away by the young and charismatic Edward IV. The man who put him there was one of England's most powerful barons, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. The story goes that Warwick, the kingmaker, turned bad, plunging the country into anarchy, and Edward had to destroy his mentor.
I'm going to show you that the truth is the seeds of Warwick's destruction were sown from the day Edward became king. All the same, it took Edward 7 long years to learn the hardest lesson of kingship, that to save his country, a good king must do bad things, and to be a great king, the kingmaker must die.
In the frozen bog of a Yorkshire field, the bloodiest battle ever fought on British soil is finally ending. Edward, Earl of March, has gambled that he can snatch the crown from the useless Henry VI and his scheming wife, Margaret of Anjou. And in this battle, he has succeeded big time. The King and Queen's forces have been wiped out. The incompetent King Henry VI is forced to flee to Scotland with his wife and son. This is total victory for Edward. This is the battlefield where Edward triumphs. Just outside the village of Towton, south of York. Perhaps 60,000 men lined up in this field, and contemporaries estimate that 28,000 of them were slaughtered in just 10 hours. That's pretty much half the troops who took to the field that morning. The soil is saturated with their blood. Henry VI may still be alive, but the throne of England is now Edward's. Standing alongside him is the man who more than anyone else made it all happen. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker.
Long live the King! Long live the King!
Vigorous, ambitious, and just 18 years old,
Let us give thanks to God!
Edward, Earl of March, is now Edward IV, the 12th Plantagenet King of England.
Arise!
But Edward's inherited a country that's been torn apart by blood feuds. It's just 3 months since the same soldiers Edward's just defeated killed his father, the Duke of York. To secure his position as king, Edward needs to end the cycle of violence. It's a mighty challenge for any leader. The man who's going to help him pull it off is his closest ally, Warwick. England is a hotbed of unrest. To stabilise it, one of Edward's first jobs is to snuff out trouble in the violent north. And of course, Warwick goes willingly to do it.
This is Bamborough Castle in Northumberland, the freezing, rain-swept northern power base of Sir Ralph Percy, leading troublemaker and a staunch supporter of Henry VI and Queen Margaret.
The dangerous Queen is in exile just across the Scottish border, barely 20 miles from Percy. Edward needs to make sure she won't be welcomed back if she tries to take revenge on him.
So on Christmas Eve, 1462, after a siege lasting less than a month, Warwick burst into this castle and takes Percy prisoner.
While Edward was fighting for the throne, Percy sided decisively with Margaret and Henry VI. That's now treason, and Percy should die. Instead, Edward offers him an extraordinary choice. He could have his head chopped off. Or, alternatively, he could come on side to Edward's cause and keep his castles, his land, and of course, his life. Decapitation? Or a life of luxury? It's not the toughest decision he's ever made. And this is Edward's big plan to secure his rule. Turn his enemies into allies. Build a broad alliance to bridge the fractured politics of England. And it seems to work. For the first time in more than 6 years, the country calms down. And Edward settles into the role of king. One man, more than any other, is responsible for Edward's success. Warwick's been the young king's mentor since long before Edward's father died. He's the go-to guy, the man who gets things done for the king. And he knows it. Warwick truly is the kingmaker, Edward's right-hand man, and he wants it to stay that way. Three years into his reign, things are looking up for Edward. He's getting the country's nobility on side, and money started trickling into a treasury that was bankrupt under Henry. There's just one more thing on his to-do list: find himself a wife. And it's not just about producing an heir to the throne. A well-chosen royal marriage could cement foreign alliances, boost trade, even increase military strength.
Your Grace.
Or with a bit of luck, all three at once. As the king's right-hand man, Warwick believes there's only one man capable of picking a winning bride for Edward. Him.
My pardon, your grace. May I take my leave, your grace, for the affairs of state of which we spoke? I'm most pleased to find you well, sir.
Please.
In March 1464, with Edward's blessing, Warwick meets envoys from King Louis XI of France to arrange the king's marriage to the French princess, Bona of Savoy. This union could stamp out the never-ending conflicts with England's deadliest enemy, France.
It is of much detail, but I pray of order.
Over the course of several weeks, he successfully brokers a deal for the king to marry the French princess. Warwick is clearly a man in charge. To the extent that one French dignitary later jokes that the English have two rulers, Warwick and another, whose name I have forgotten. That sort of thing can go to a man's head. Warwick is the power behind the throne. He's made Edward king. Now he's organised the future of the royal dynasty too. In September 1464, Warwick arrives at Reading Abbey with England's other senior nobles to confirm marriage arrangements for Edward. And he gets to announce it to the adulation of the realm's great and good. What could possibly go wrong? Before Warwick, or indeed any of the other nobles, has a chance to speak, Edward stands up to make an announcement of his own.
My lords, I have glad tidings for you.
He's already married. In fact, he got married almost 5 months ago, while Warwick was still negotiating with the French.
My consort is a lady of great virtue, wit, and beauty. The Lady Elizabeth Woodville.
Worse, instead of a valuable foreign princess, he's chosen one of his own subjects. And she's been married before. It's unheard of. The king has made a total fool of Warwick, and everybody knows it. After the coronation ceremony, Edward celebrates and lays on a spectacular feast for his new queen. Edward may be pleased with his new bride, but in the eyes of Warwick and many of the other nobles, Queen Elizabeth's family is basically the enemy, because her father, Sir Richard Woodville, fought against Edward at Towton. Warwick feels so betrayed, he doesn't even make an appearance. But even if the Woodvilles were whiter than white, most of the nobility would find their elevation to the top of society pretty hard to swallow. Elizabeth may be extraordinarily beautiful, but she's a widow. She already has 2 children, and she comes from a large family of extremely ambitious but very minor nobles. Edward IV, King of England, has basically married a chav. Elizabeth brings along her whole family to celebrate,
That's 2 sons, 3 brothers, 6 sisters, her mum and dad, and her extended family. This looks less like a celebration for Edward and his new queen, more like a pitch invasion by the Woodvilles.
Most of the senior nobility are pretty unhappy about what they see as a huge bunch of low-ranking opportunists muscling in on the well-established order. And they're right to be concerned. Edward's already planning to start forcibly marrying the Woodvilles into the old aristocracy. Elizabeth's 20-year-old brother John will end up married to the 65-year-old Countess of Oxford. It's all very unsavoury. So what was Edward thinking by marrying Elizabeth? He knew it would enrage Warwick, which is why he kept it secret for so long. Rumours spread that Edward's fallen for the oldest trick in the book. That the beautiful Elizabeth simply played hard to get. Apparently marriage was the only way he could bed her. Elizabeth's certainly the kind of person who'd have played that card. She's smart, beautiful, ruthlessly loyal to her own family, and extremely ambitious. Incredibly, it looks as though the strong-willed Edward IV has married for love, or at least for lust. And that's pretty easy for people to believe. Edward has a fabulously well-deserved reputation for being led by his loins. But I think there's more to it than that. The marriage fits perfectly with Edward's plan of reaching out to his former enemies, starting with the Woodvilles. He's prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt. As far as Edward's concerned, they just backed the wrong horse at Towton. And in July 1465, 3 months after Elizabeth's coronation, Edward receives a late wedding present. Henry VI. He's left exile in Scotland and been caught skulking around in the north of England. Edward has him locked up here at the Tower of London, but instead of having him executed, Edward maintains his policy of reaching out to his former enemies. So he orders that Henry's well treated. He's put up in the royal apartments. He's given good food and wine. He's even allowed visitors. Things seem to be going incredibly well for Edward. But he knows he's snubbed Warwick. And the king goes all out to make it up to him. He gives him the castle of Cockermouth, the hereditary office of Sheriff of Westmoreland, custody of all the royal forests north of the Trent, profits of all the royal gold and silver mines in the same region, wardship of the lands of the wealthy peer Lord Lovell, and control of England's most imposing castle, Dover. But Warwick already has money and land. What he wants, what he needs, is to be Edward's indispensable right-hand man, just as he's always been. And that's the one thing Edward can't give him. Warwick was the perfect ally for snatching the crown, ruthless and bold. But that's in the past. What England needs now is stability, not war. And that's why, from Edward's point of view, the Woodvilles are the future. They're an essential part of his plan for spreading royal influence into the rest of the nobility. But from Warwick's point of view, well, he's the only one who should be able to exert that kind of influence over the reign. Edward can have Warwick, or he can have the Woodvilles. He can't have both. And squaring that circle will dog the next 5 years of Edward's reign. In 1467, Edward sends Warwick to see his French allies. Both Warwick and the French king, Louis XI, believe they are negotiating a lucrative new trade deal between the two countries. They're not. Edward just wants Warwick out of the way,
I pray you are well, my lord.
Thank you.
because he's about to humiliate him utterly. With Warwick out of the way, Edward organises a massive tournament at Smithfield, just outside London's city walls. It has one purpose: to ally England with the Burgundians, the Woodville's favourites. Unfortunately, they just happen to be the mortal enemies of Warwick's pals, the French.
Enough, my lords!
Enough.
Pride of place goes to the Queen's brother, Anthony Woodville. He's been fighting the guest of honour, the son of the Duke of Burgundy, in the tournament show fight. Putting a Burgundian in the show fight is the most public possible advertisement that Edward doesn't give a damn about the French. When the French discover that the English king is in bed with the hated Burgundians, they will know that Warwick has become utterly irrelevant.
My king would most solemnly accept these terms. Many thanks.
Edward has clearly made his choice. He's chosen the Woodvilles over Warwick. Warwick's supposed to be the king's right-hand man. Edward has made him look a fool. Again. It's no surprise that Warwick is becoming paranoid that his influence over Edward is slipping away. It is. Warwick's not the sort of man to disappear quietly into retirement, so he comes up with a plan to win back his influence with the king. He's going to marry his daughter Isabel to the king's shallow, self-serving younger brother, the Duke of Clarence. Until Elizabeth produces a son, Clarence is heir to the crown. So Warwick clearly sees this as a way to leapfrog the Woodvilles.
Your Grace, the union of my daughter with Lord Clarence would clearly...
Enough. Shall not be.
Edward flat out refuses Warwick's proposition.
Pray we shall discuss it no more.
He argues that Clarence has to marry for political gain,
Your move, cousin.
which is pretty rich considering Edward's own track record.
Come on.
Warwick's power and influence over the king has gone. It's an intolerable position for the kingmaker.
Is it by design you have made my victory so easy?
If there's any doubt about who he blames for the rift, Warwick spells it out by refusing to attend a meeting of the King's Council in Coventry if the Queen's father, Lord Rivers, is present. Warwick hates the Queen's Woodville family with such a passion, he can't even stand to be in the same room as them. So, what's he going to do about it?
Warwick doesn't have to wait long to take his revenge. Just 2 years after the tournament, tax riots break out across the north. Fueled by rumours that the Woodvilles are skimming off tax money for themselves. the riots threaten to tear apart the fragile peace that Edward has built up. And one man is poised to fan the flames and set the kingdom ablaze. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. By June 1469, rumours circulate that there are 60,000 men being mustered in Yorkshire under the banner of the mysterious rebel, Robin of Redesdale. Chroniclers describe it as the Great Insurrection. Robin of Redesdale has to be stopped. Suddenly, the king needs Warwick back in the game.
On July the 9th, Edward writes to Warwick asking for his help. What he gets in return is a deafening silence. Hurt and embittered at being discarded by the king, Warwick's turned to Edward's weak and venal younger brother, Clarence. They're in Calais, where Warwick's married Clarence to his daughter. This is some piece of scheming from Warwick. It's a direct violation of royal orders and a very explicit challenge to royal authority.
Edward writes to Warwick again almost immediately. He says he's heard he's up to no good and demands that he meet the king in Nottingham to explain himself. Warwick and Clarence don't come. Instead, they publish an open letter. There's a 500-year-old copy of it here at the Bodleian Library in Oxford.
And this is it. And it begins, "Right trusty and well beloved, we greet you well." Well, that's medieval English for hello. But then it gets straight down to business, and it says that certain seditious persons have been practicing a deceivable, covetous rule about the king. Who are those persons? Well, here they are named: Lord Rivers and the Duchess of Bedford. That's the Queen Elizabeth Woodville's mother and father. Mentions Lord Scales, that's her brother Anthony, Sir John Woodville and his brethren, and others of their mischievous rule, opinion, and assent. In other words, anyone of the Woodville clan we might have forgotten to mention. And it accuses them of enriching themselves at the country's expense. But what's really amazing is the last line of this letter, which says that anyone who shares this opinion should be at Canterbury upon Sunday next. That's an open invitation to rebellion. So far from siding with the king, Warwick and Clarence are supporting the rebels. Or, if you want to put it another way, they've gone rogue.
On July the 16th, 1469, Warwick lands in Kent with his new son-in-law, Edward's younger brother, Clarence. 2 days later, they head north from London at the vanguard of an army. Publicly, Warwick tells anyone who'll listen that he's on Edward's side and is only trying to save his friend from the Woodvilles. How very selfless of him. In reality, with the king in Nottingham with a small army, Warwick's craftily creating a pincer movement. The king is caught between Warwick approaching from the south and Robin of Redesdale's men in the north. Warwick is going to war with the king.
The confrontation on July the 26th is less of a battle and more of a rout. Warwick's forces annihilate the royalists, and Warwick brings Edward as a prisoner here to Middleham Castle.
Warwick's success may look like an opportunistic punt that takes advantage of Robin of Redesdale's rebellion. And that's certainly what Warwick wants everyone to believe. But we now know that the shadowy figure of Redesdale is almost certainly Sir John Conyers, a loyal servant of the Kingmaker. The entire rebellion was stage managed by Warwick.
So Warwick's got the king banged up. Question is, what's his end game? Because if you're going to imprison a king, you'd better be prepared to replace and to kill him too. So Warwick's best bet might be to have Edward declared a bastard and replaced with the vain and malleable Clarence. But that'll never work so long as Edward's still alive and Warwick's not prepared to take the final step. So maybe he's trying to keep his options open, but he's got the king locked up. I don't think he's really thought this through.
Warwick has balked at killing the king. Instead, he takes out his frustration and hatred in a killing spree designed to wipe out as many of the Woodvilles as possible. The highest profile victim is Edward's father-in-law, Lord Rivers. On August the 12th, 1469, he's executed at Kenilworth Castle without a trial. Without a king at large, the fragile peace that Edward built up between his warring nobles now collapses into violence with astonishing speed. And the unrest that Warwick engineered during the Redesdale riots backfires on him, setting off the rest of the country. Desperate to put a lid on the violence, Warwick appeals to other nobles for help stabilising the country. But there's nothing in it for them in helping Warwick, so they just laugh at him. After all, he's the one who arrested the king and triggered all the trouble in the first place. This is exactly why Warwick is such a poor peacetime ally, and exactly why Edward was sidelining him. Warwick's great at the rapid action, the pincer movement he used to capture Edward. Well, that's right up his street. What he can't grasp are the politics and the compromises necessary to actually run a country. Warwick's decision to grab Edward without a coherent plan to replace or to kill him has blown up in his face, and England is descending into anarchy. Little more than a month after locking Edward up, Warwick is forced into a catastrophic climb down. The word awkward probably doesn't do justice to the first meeting between Warwick and the king.
Sire, all that was done for the good of the realm.
Edward's back in control of England. Astonishingly, he sticks to his policy of appeasing his enemies. He forgives Warwick and Clarence. It's recorded that Edward even calls them his best friends. But Warwick clearly remains a dangerous man, and England remains perilously unstable. In March 1470, rebellion breaks out in Lincolnshire, and Edward sends in the troops. They meet the rebels at the village of Empingham, near Peterborough. Edward's men scatter the rebels, and as they run, they tear off any clothing that could identify them, which is why the battle site is known as Loosecope Field. But when Edward's men run through the rebel leader, Sir Robert Wells, they find hidden inside his helmet letters implicating Warwick and Clarence in the rebellion. It's a damning piece of evidence. Edward can never trust them again. This is Warwick's second act of treason. He's bull-headed, but he's not a fool. He knows the king will be coming for him, and this time there'll be no hugs and best buddies. Warwick, the mighty kingmaker, utterly disgraced, is reduced to running for the safety of France, taking Clarence with him. Warwick now has just two choices. He can live out his life in exile, or he can go large and try to wipe out Edward permanently. But to pull that off, he needs a powerful ally. Someone who, if it were possible, hates Edward even more than he does. Margaret of Anjou, wife of the previous king, Henry VI.
My lord.
The Duke of Clarence.
Since her husband's capture nearly 10 years ago, she's been living in frustrated and powerless exile in her native France.
My queen.
Out of this meeting between the incensed Warwick and the furious ex-queen comes a breathtaking, outrageous plan. Kick Edward off the throne and replace him with Henry VI, the old king, currently locked up in the Tower. After all, Warwick's the kingmaker, isn't he? He did it for Edward. Surely he can do it for Henry.
Warwick lands on the Devonshire coast with a small, fast-moving army and heads north. Edward's near Doncaster when he's woken in the middle of the night and warned that enemy troops are just a mile away. Edward's troops are completely outnumbered. He can stand and fight, but the odds don't look good. Or he can run for it. Edward flees to Flanders.
And as if that wasn't enough, Edward has been forced to abandon the woman who precipitated all his problems. Elizabeth Woodville, now pregnant again, has sought sanctuary here at Westminster Abbey.
In October, after 10 years in captivity, Warwick releases Henry VI from the Tower.
Long live the king!
This is the man that Warwick's depending on to save England from itself. He must be mad.
Henry was always a disaster as king, and nothing's changed. But he's the only card that Warwick has left. So, for the second time in his life, Henry VI is King of England.
With thousands of men behind him, Edward heads south to London. To avoid confronting Edward, Warwick's holed up in Coventry. He sends a desperate message to London to try and rally support behind Henry VI.
The result is indeed desperate. On Maundy Thursday, 1471, in a shambolic piece of political theatre, Henry's paraded through the streets of London. But all that the thin crowd that turns out sees is a feeble, half-senile man. So all that Warwick is doing is pointing out, in the bluntest possible way, all the king's failings. On the same day that Henry's paraded through the streets, Edward enters London at the head of an army. The contrast with the weak and feeble old king couldn't be more extreme. Edward's a strapping, energetic young man, the picture-perfect example of kingship. And whereas Henry's parade was greeted with derision, Edward's welcomed with universal acclaim. And the first thing he does is come here to St. Paul's to give thanks for his safe arrival. Then it's down to business.
Edward heads across the river to Lambeth Palace, where Henry VI is waiting.
My cousin of York.
All will be well.
Edward may sound reassuring, but ominously, he immediately has Henry taken back to the Tower. Then Edward heads back across the Thames as fast as possible. He comes here to Westminster Abbey to be reunited with his wife Elizabeth, who has been sheltering from Henry's men under the laws of sanctuary. While he's been away, Elizabeth has given birth to a fine baby boy. Edward has got his throne back, his wife back, and he's got a son and heir. He is King of England again. But he's learned the lessons of kingship the hard way.
However much Edward wants to avoid bloodshed and recrimination, forgiveness has its limits. And sometimes the only way to keep your throne is to deploy the ultimate sanction: death. So Edward heads north with his army to hunt Warwick down.
On April the 14th, 1471, Warwick and Edward go into battle one last time at Barnet. Just like at Towton, Edward and Warwick are in the thick of it. They must both know that only one of them can leave the field alive. Warwick throws 15,000 men into the fight, Edward 12,000. The odds favour Warwick, but confused by heavy fog, his army accidentally attacks itself. In the chaos, Edward's army overwhelms Warwick's men. Warwick flees the battlefield. But he's hunted down like a dog by Edward's troops. The Kingmaker is dead.
Edward has Warwick's body brought to London. It's stripped naked, except for a cloth covering the genitals, and it's put on display for everyone to see at the old medieval cathedral here in St. Paul's. Edward's sending a very simple, very plain message to the entire country.
The new king has learned the old lessons.
Your Grace.
There will be no more forgiveness.
Make sure it's done.
On May the 21st, 1471, barely a month after Edward's victory over Warwick, Henry dies. The official cause of death is pure displeasure and melancholy, but few people believe that. It's reported that his corpse is found with congealed blood in his hair. Whether he was cudgeled to death or not, there's no doubt at all that Edward has had him killed.
Edward came to the throne determined to break the cycle of violence that had been consuming England, but it just couldn't be done. I mean, look at the last 11 weeks. He's invaded England, raised an army, fought a brutal battle, killed his friend, and murdered a rival king. And that is the reality of medieval kingship. In the end, there was only ever one way that Edward was going to earn his crown: in blood.
Next time, the most infamous story in the entire blood-soaked era. Richard III snatches the throne. The only obstacles are his own nephews, the princes in the Tower.
Witchcraft. No, you've got just enough Church of England in here, just enough. Now, you know, we're pre-Henry VIII, okay, so, but on the continent, you've got rumblings, and you've had rumblings ever since the 1200s when the Crusaders came back disillusioned. So then when you get into the 1300s, 13s and 14s now, on the continent, you've got a lot of, how do I phrase this? Well, it's the Medici family. And the Medicis become the Pope. And they start going down different paths other than what today's, yeah, I can use the word Catholic Church preaches. At the time, there's no Reformation, so it's the Christian church. So there's no Catholic, there's no Protestant, there's nothing. There is just the Christian and the Muslim. That's what you got. But this Christian church is going to split 2, 3, 4 times. And now it's probably 100 times. But yes, it's going to split. But it's going to split because of the internal problems. And it's going to split because of some, let's just call them ne'er-do-well. A few popes were out to turn a few prophets.
The narrator, I liked him, he was good, wearing the wrong walking shoes, frankly. However, when he was looking at the document and pointing things out, should he have been wearing gloves? Was that an original document?
Yes, but it was,
Those kind of documents are so,
yeah. For him to have it out, it was under something. It was probably under plexi.
I mean, it was so
And his hand was going. Yeah. Well,
and you know how crazy they are about those type of documents. His oil on his hand, I was just astonished. You know, they usually have white gloves and.
yeah.
But this is like a better one. They actually have
No, don't, you know,
This guy did one of those things with the wrist and the sword twirled in his hand. I'm going, no,
no,
no.
no.
Those things are two-handed,
Well,
heavy.
they're at the Minnesota Renaissance Festival. And I worked out there for 20 years, so I. Okay. Well, then we'll just have to wait until next week and see what happens.